here. I think you'll still have yes. Okay. We're still deciding.
We have a script to follow.
Welcome to KahnFest. Welcome to Stanford. Yay! What a wonderful time to be here. It was just phenomenal 2 days already. I think the party lasts 8 hours, so this is going to be okay. We'll finish very nicely. One thing I want to do really quickly is to thank our invited speakers yesterday and today. It's just phenomenal talks, and the breadth, and just like, you know, it really gave us a whole sense of the things, how Steve thinks about things, and how we all like to think about the system, what it all takes to get amazing science. Phenomenal job. Thank you so much, all invited speakers. Do a couple of things really quick. I want to thank Steve Allen as one of the co-chairs of the committee, who's done an amazing job. There's so many people to thank. We did a little bit of that on Thursdays, Tuesdays. Thank you so much. There's a lot of parts in here. Fritz Perels, where are you? Oh my gosh, the band. Without you, you know, this event would have been nowhere near as imaginative. Thank you so much. It made a big difference. It's a great time. It's an awesome institute. We're at a height, and Steve's speaking, as you all got to see this 2 days. Enjoy dinner. Let me introduce our MC for the evening. Almost like a rapper. Yeah. I'm sure you got that. Peter Michelson, the chair of physics. The way he explained it to me is he's been here a long time.
Yeah. So. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for coming to this wonderful event, and I have instructions on what I'm supposed to do, so I'll try to follow it. But I first of all want to congratulate Steve on achieving. We'll return to this theme later about getting old, but we'll get back to that. But we have this evening. I want to thank the staff of the physics department and KaiPAC for organizing this event, the local organizing committee. They did a wonderful job, and let's thank them now. And after dinner, we'll be having a number of talks from friends and colleagues of Steve's. I didn't preview the talk, so I didn't censor any of it, so you'll have to see when we get there. But I do want to read one message from a colleague of Steve's, actually a student with Steve, who was in graduate school with you at UC Berkeley when you were doing your PhD. And he sent an email, he couldn't make it, and that's Peter Jacobson, who's adjunct professor in the Cosmology Center at the Niels Bohr Institute, and he writes, this is not a long message. Sorry that my wife and I couldn't be with you and Susan out there in sunny California, perhaps next time. But congratulations on writing out the 70 orbits all the same, and no qualifying for joining the ranks of us senior citizens. We'll return to that. There's little point in me trying to wax poetic about the big man on campus you've obviously become over there in Stanford. Others will no doubt keep on the phrase for better than I could ever hope to do. Besides, in my eyes, you'll always remain just one of us punks from Steve Boyer's old group in Berkeley. So, anyway, let's have dinner and we'll return with the entertainment later. Steve, probably knew that. Susan will introduce the first event of this evening. Susan.
Hi, it's my pleasure to introduce to you someone we have known since he was in utero. Jesse Shaman, the beloved son of Rich and Sarah, our lifetime friends. And Jesse is a saxophonist, songwriter, singer, band leader, educator in New York City. He's the leader of the band Jesse and Forever, and a graduate of the Berklee School of Music. By the way, Steve always told Jesse, you know, you should become a physicist. But Jesse, instead, has performed around the world at venues like the Blue Note, the Panama Jazz Festival, the Umbria Jazz Festival, the Monterey Jazz Festival, my God, the Cuba Jazz Festival in his hometown of Santa Cruz. I've heard him play many times, and we are delighted and excited that he can join us to perform at KahnFest tonight. So thank you, Jesse, and Jesse Forever, thank you.
Thank you. As Susan said, I've known Steve my entire life. He's been like an uncle, and seeing him in a lot of more informal situations like this, so it was pretty cool recently when Susan sent us all a video and it was Steve and Bill Gates trying to convince us to invest in his gigantic telescope. So we're playing some of Steve's favorite songs tonight, and Steve and my dad both worked at WKCR, the jazz radio station, in the 70s at Columbia. And so Steve has some eccentric tastes in music compared to many people in the universe, hence our presence. And so we're playing some of his favorite songs. We started with Priestess by a saxophonist named Billy Harper, who I believe both Steve and my dad Richard listened to and went and saw perform in the 70s. And once again, this is not a song that people request you to play at their birthday parties generally. We followed with a song by Thelonious Monk called Ugly Beauty, which I believe has been important in your life and my parents' life as well. And now we're going to play a song called Beatrice, which is by a saxophonist named Sam Rivers. And the two of them back in the 70s used to go to Sam Rivers' loft in Greenwich Village. And Beatrice was Sam Rivers' wife. And this song is written by Sam Rivers for Beatrice, who several people in this room have met. So, here we go. Josh Benson Yoker on the bass. My name is Jesse Shaman. Steve Kahn forever!
I think some of them actually are about Steve, and we didn't preview the talk, so I don't know what's going to be said. But we're going to hear from Roger Blanford, Martin Weisskopf, Harvey Tandem, and Tony Tyson. So I'll start with Roger Blanford. Roger came to Stanford, I don't remember him actually, but it's probably just too much longer than that. But Roger and Steve arrived on the same day and started the Coffee Institute here at Stanford. Roger is director and Steve is deputy director. And that's been a great success to which we owe them both a debt of gratitude. And so Roger will give the first talk. Roger?
Steve Kahn was born in Brooklyn so long ago that the Dodgers were still in town. He had a conventional upbringing that I suspect was shared by many of you experimental astrophysicists here in this room. He was a good and diligent student. As a child, he taught himself basic electronics by playing with radios and performing simple chemistry experiments at home. He taught himself the rudiments of probability and statistics. His community was so struck with his talent that he was sent to Columbia. He graduated fast. So Columbia, thought rightfully, was able to send him to Berkeley, where he worked with his mentor, Stu Boyer, who I'm so delighted to see here, and who taught Steve so many valuable lessons, including sensitive and effective management of your bosses. Before long, Berkeley had tired, so they sent him back to Columbia and some funny East Coast school. And then he went back to Berkeley. And then back to Columbia, and so on and so forth. During one of these moves, Steve got the wrong super shuttle at San Francisco Airport, and he ended up at Stanford. These peregrinations were always accompanied by a large number of cardboard boxes, the contents of which were long forgotten, but were known to be valuable. Fortunately, Steve has stayed long enough at Stanford, in fact 12 years, that he has actually unpacked some of them. This is a good sign. So, as you heard from Peter, Steve and I came here for KahnFest, which when we arrived was a thriving organisation populated by eager young minds, shown here in our first group photograph. At this time, Steve was the lead of the XMM Newton reflection grating spectrometer, whatever that is. As a humble theorist, I wouldn't know what it looks like, so I searched the web under Newton spectroscopy and was actually able to download an image. I hope I got it right. Steve also took on major responsibilities for the then big X-ray mission on campus called KahnFest. When you think about it, it was not a great name if you were trying to impress people with your seriousness. These were, of course, very big projects, and Steve had to learn new skills to work with them and to manage them. He'd not taken any courses on this in either Berkeley or Columbia, so he had to rely on the movies. The first one, of course, he had to take was fundraising. The next was personnel management, followed by purchasing. You may not remember the movie, but this is the scene where Woody says to Diane Keaton, "If you really believe what I'm saying, there's a bridge over there." Well, okay. It's actually Brooklyn Bridge, of course, yes. Other skills that he had to learn were time management and schedule. Steve, as a native New Yorker, had also learned that an important way to garner the proper respect from the people who were supposed to be working for you was to dress well. And to dress consistently. So here's Steve, as he was at that time. The centerpiece of his fashion statement was always the sweater. Pay no attention to the hairline, the beard, the glasses, the sweater. He's looking worried because of the equations. Here he is beside the newly constructed LSST. He's looking happy for some reason. This is what he looked like yesterday. But some believe that these are different sweaters. But as a theorist, I have developed a conjecture. If you knit carefully, and you admit the possibility of turning them inside out and back to front, you can make one sweater last for a whole university sojourn. Anyway, so soon after he arrived, Steve was casting around for his next project, and he entertained a very large number of options. But it was actually clear that the one he really wanted to work on was LSST, and we heard a lot about that at this meeting, and Jonathan Dorvan explained how eventually, through some miracle, he was able to speak first to Jonathan and then the DOE to go ahead and build the camera. And this has consumed him pretty much ever since. Now, the optics of a 10 square degree field turned out to be rather challenging. And he and his colleagues had to use M theory to solve it. However, an even larger challenge was the mechanical engineering. And he didn't quite know how to address it, and the solution he came up was absolutely brilliant. This is the telescope, there's the thing, and the solution was quite uplifting. In fact, it quite raised one's spirits, seeing how the telescope's there. And in fact, the telescope they've designed is so wonderful, so powerful, that you can see right across the universe, even during the day. And through cloud. LSST will be awesome. There's another goal, of course, of LSST. The DOE wants us to tell us about the properties of dark energy and so on. But the rest of us are more concerned by being hit by an Earth-crossing asteroid and wiping out life as we know it on Earth. Rest assured, if Steve and his crew miss one of these, we are promised our money back. Anyway, let me conclude with a few personal remarks. Steve, as you will have heard, has an occasional tendency to overextend. He succeeded Persis Drell running the combined high-energy physics and astrophysics directorate. His first task was to rename it, and as a crossword puzzle enthusiast, he was able to juggle the letters to come up with PAP, A, Ape, PP. For some reason, he rejected all of this and settled on PPA, which his successor, Dave McFarland, as a Canadian, still thinks is a term of approbation for particle physics. I mention this because this organisational unit will be disbanded tomorrow to be replaced by a division led by Tom Abel, from whom you've just heard, and whom we all wish well in this new responsibility. So after serving slack in this way, not learning his lessons, Steve took on the chairmanship of the physics department on campus, and for 3 years he reorganised the teaching, raised support. I'm not sure which was the harder task, but he succeeded in both of them. Then he succeeded Tony Tyson, who is here, and you'll hear from shortly, as the project director of LSST. And although Steve and I have never really collaborated scientifically, we have known each other for many years, long before we came to Stanford. And I developed, in fact, an unshakable confidence in Steve's technical strengths, his ambition and his drive. And this, coupled with the unstinting support of the greater Stanford community, the Calvary Foundation and our Californian colleagues, made it a less risky enterprise than it might have seemed to many of our friends and colleagues outside when we both first came here. So I would like to say, first of all, thank you, Steve, very much for being such a wonderful partner, a great partner, and a colleague, and for all the extraordinary leadership and accomplishment you have brought to Stanford. So, next, I would like to acknowledge Susan, who has put up with all these mad pursuits and struggles to escape with grace, good humour, and wise counsel whenever he was in town. And finally, I would like to recognise a lady I have not yet met, but hope to shortly after this meal, and that is Steve's mother, Muriel Kahn. Although I'm sure that to you, Steve is very much a work in progress, I do hope that you are as proud of your son as we all are. Subsequent speakers will recognise Susan and Steve, but let me please take this opportunity to ask you to raise your glasses to Muriel Kahn. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roger. So our next speaker this evening is Martin Weisskopf, who I think most of you know, but in case you don't, Marty is currently the project scientist at Marshall Space Flight Center for the Chandra X-ray Observatory.
Always.
Always. And he's, this is a project that is a great success and known due to his efforts and also to our next speaker, Harvey Tannenbaum. And so I look forward to your talk, and he'll entertain us next. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to blame the organizers for having me follow Roger, who has clearly prepared a much better speech than I have been able to. I think I should first of all begin by saying that this conference that we just had these last 2 days has been one of the most interesting conferences that I've ever been to. And Steve, I hope we can celebrate your birthday every bloody year with a conference like this. It's worth it. In some sense, we all kind of know how life is a little bit bizarre and its ups and downs, etc. But in some respects, apart from Muriel's efforts, I'm one of the reasons you're here. I needed money as a starving assistant professor with 2 kids at Columbia in the 70s. So I agreed to take on the duty of freshman advisor for incoming freshman class, and then I would even have to take on that same class the sophomore year, for which I was paid the municipal sum of $500 the first year. Well, considering my salary was $11,000, it was non-trivial. And they sent me the resumes of the people that were coming in, and there was this one resume of a young man who had placed out of at least the first year of college. And I said, that's pretty good. This kid must be pretty smart. And sure enough, this tall, skinny kid came in. He doesn't look so skinny now. So I got to do something about that. But he sure was skinny then. And we talked to a friend of mine, Peter Sutherland, who was a theorist working with Mount Ruderman at the time. And both Peter and I got interested in the topic of Cygnus X1 and its time variability. And we looked at Steve's resume and said, we ought to get this kid involved in this stuff. It looks like he's going to be pretty smart. So, as you've heard from speakers, that Steve likes to get interested in things he doesn't know anything about. In fact, this was a tradition of the Columbia Astrophysics Lab, of which I was a part of. We all got interested in things we knew nothing about. Bob Novick, the director of the laboratory, had been working in atomic physics for about 20 years. He was a student of Willis Lamb's, and he decided for some god-awful reason to get interested in X-ray astronomy, which was really cool. And I was in atomic physics as a graduate student, and he recruited me to Columbia. And it was really nice. I went to a meeting with Ricardo Giacconi, and they talked about sex. They talked about pigs. Sex was the super explorer. Pig was the principal investigator group, which is aptly named. So we were a team of scientists that were interested in things we know nothing about. And working on Cygnus X1, we found some things that were the astrophysicists and the astronomers and the physicists share in common. They know damn all about statistics. And we worked on this problem for a couple of years with Steve. It was an integral part. And we had to deal with the problem for the first time of what happens if you have 2 stochastic processes going on at the same time. Non-trivial problem. Counting statistics from the X-ray detectors and the shot noise variability from Cygnus X1. Steve mentioned earlier today that those were his first 2 papers in the field, and we got him going there on getting some interest in astronomy and astrophysics. The other thing that's been mentioned a lot here in this symposium is about Steve's travels back and forth between the East Coast, or the right coast and the left coast. And I think we played a role in that, because as Steve was getting ready to finish his undergraduate education, we urged him, by all means, get out of Columbia, don't stay here, as much as we'd love to have him. And so he went on to Berkeley, and we started that yo-yo back and forth. Susan, you should thank us. You might not have ever met Steve if it wasn't for Peter and me. So the one thing that I'll finish with, apart from the obvious thing, happy birthday to you and congratulations to everybody involved. One of the things that Peter and I did, and those of you that know me, is I'm a basketball freak. I've been playing, well, I stopped now finally, but I played basketball from the age of 8 to 68. And of course, we had to drag Steve into that, to the teachers' college across the street. And one thing I want to tell you is don't get in an elevator, crowded elevator with him. That kid has sharp elbows. Congrats, Steve.
Thank you, Marty. So our next speaker is Harvey Tannenbaum, who is a legend in X-ray astronomy, and he's been a leader at the Chandra X-ray Observatory at the Harvard-Smithsonian Laboratory of Astrophysics in Cambridge. Anyway, Harvey's a legend, and I'll let him have the stage now. Thank you.
So what have I learned in the last couple of days? Had a lot of fun yesterday talking about some future projects and future ideas, and certainly have a lot of enthusiasm and energy laying out things that we hopefully are going to do over the next 10, 20, or 30 years. Had a great conversation with Steve, telling him how young 60 was and how much there was still to be done. I learned a lot tonight. Don't ever agree to be an after-dinner speaker and let Roger Branford be the first speaker on the program, because you're in a lot of trouble. My wife looked over to Martin and me about 5 minutes into Roger's presentation, maybe 2 minutes, and she said, "You guys are screwed." I learned not to bother writing a few things down on a sheet of paper, because by the time you speak as the third speaker, a lot of those things probably have been said. I can tell you that Steve's sweaters in the old days weren't nearly as nice as the ones in the picture that Roger showed. And they really weren't all one color. In those days they were all blue. I think it was one sweater, and it was a big baggy blue sweater. But let's not talk about that. I did know Steve. I met him as a postdoc when he came to Cambridge for a couple of years, from 80 to 82. We worked very, very hard to try to convince him to stay on. I think he had already pretty much concluded that being in a university environment and working with students and teaching was a big part of what he wanted to do, along with the research that he wanted to do. And he had an opportunity to pursue that. And so he, I don't know, he broke our hearts and moved on or back to Columbia. I had a whole monologue worked out about Columbia, Berkeley, and Ken Irwin busted that in the second talk on the first day of the symposium with the map and the migration and the charts. I will say that I did get to write a lot of letters of recommendation for Steve over the years. Going back through them, almost every letter started by saying how Steve was so exceptional with his interest and expertise in instrumentation, an emphasis on spectroscopy, but really wanting to push the envelope with regard to what we could build and what we could do in astrophysics. And when we started the poorly named, according to Roger, KahnFest project in the 90s, Steve was the first person I approached about joining the team and helping to do imaging and spectroscopy together. And I think that mission will actually happen, whether it's the X-ray surveyor or SmartX name, but the concepts that we're talking about now are even more powerful than what we were looking at in the late 90s and the early part of the 2000s. And I fully expect Steve, with everything else he's doing, to somehow find a little bit of time to help make that happen and be a very special project. I did count the number of trips back and forth officially on faculty at Columbia and Berkeley. I think there was a little time spent in Chicago in the middle there. Harvard offered him a professorship about 2001 or so, and I think he thought about it long and hard. But then Stanford came along and convinced him that this was the place to come and spend better than a decade now. Now that he's the director of LSST, he of course spent some of his time in Tucson and some of his time here. Where's Isaac? Is he? So Isaac, could you stand up for just a second? This is Steve and Susan's son, Isaac. So I have two things for Isaac. One is that if I find out that the LSST is being relocated from Chile to Scottsdale or Phoenix, I know that Isaac had a prime piece of real estate that he sold to his dad. And the second thing is, please don't tell either mom or dad that Tucson is neither on the East Coast or the West Coast. I think that Steve will be a superb leader of the LSST, and the project is unbelievably fortunate to have him taking it over. I think we're at a point in terms of our fields that some of the things that we did in the earlier days of space astronomy apply very well to these large projects on the ground. And I think the melding of some of the experience of building large teams and thinking about how you're going to use the telescope before you finish building it and actually in the act of using it, they're all very important. And I think Steve is an incredible candidate, and not candidate, incredible director for the LSST. All of this said, I was flying out, one of the few flights to get out of Boston on Wednesday on JetBlue. And of course my wife looks at the sunshine and the warm temperatures and then talks to our friends back in Boston and says we need to live in California. So I think, Susan, I think that philosophy is beginning to win in our household some as well. But the nice thing about JetBlue is you have your own individual little TV, and after I listen to lots of music from the 50s and the 60s and ESPN with a trailer that you can barely read for 3 or 4 hours, practically going blind. The local network stations come out of New York, and there they were at 11-something local time New York, showing a feed with a fellow named Brian Metzger from the physics department at Columbia, who also happens to be somebody I know. He was a Harvard grad student, and he's was an Einstein fellow, and so very much an up-and-coming leader in our field. And what he had to say sort of surprised me a bit, so I went online and Googled and found that the actual things that he was saying were reported in the New York Times, so they must have been true. And what I have to tell you is that Steve really blew it. Steve left Columbia and missed the best opportunity of his potential career, because the report from Brian Metzger and from the New York Times was that the NFL investigator seeks to consult a Columbia physicist over the Patriots' deflated footballs. And they have formally asked Columbia Physics Department to help them in understanding how weather or temperature could affect the pressure in the footballs. So I think that Steve clearly missed the best potential career opportunity. Thank you.
So our last speaker of the evening, I have to personally introduce Tony Tyson. I think I've known longer than anybody else in this room. And I don't remember when we first met, but it was at Bell Labs, and you were doing some crazy experiments. And you're still doing crazy stuff. But, and I indulged in that for a while. That is the detection of gravitational radiation the quest to do that. And someday maybe you'll come back to that. But anyway, Tony really was probably the key person in getting what is now called LSST going, and that's a great contribution to science, and we're looking forward to the results. But anyway, Tony, you have the stage. Thanks.
So it's a pleasure to be here, and this has been a fantastic meeting. And I have to say that Steve joined the project after the first few years. The projects have been going since 1996, but he's the best scientist to join this project, and I'll say some more words about that later. But what I'm going to tell you is the hidden story behind LSST. You all know about the fantastic technology that we developed. Steve and the rest of us have been working for years in developing, pushing the envelope in technology, and it's great. And we have this new machine that's about to hit the sky in 2018 to 2020 that will revolutionize our understanding of the universe. But to build something really large, you've got to raise a lot of money. And so I'm going to talk to you about the dark years. And I'm going to give you a couple of actually snippets from that, both humorous. There are ones that weren't. But I'm going to tell you about the humorous incidents that occurred when we were trying to think out of the box about that. So this is a story really about changes of names. So the original name that I gave this project was the Dark Matter Telescope, because what I wanted to do was to map the dark matter in the universe by using the mirage effect that it creates in the background, called gravitational lensing. And so it just seemed natural to call it the Dark Matter Telescope, and so I promoted the idea that actually, as you know, it can do a lot more. But at the very last moment, I realized that there was going to be this meeting of something called the Decadal Survey, and this was on a Friday. Somebody told me this was going to happen on Monday. There's going to be a meeting on something called the Decadal Survey. And so I went to the Bell Labs Repro department, and I said, I need 50 copies of this document by Sunday. And we got it. Nice glossy brochure and the Dark Matter Telescope, and we slipped it under the door. And so this Decadal Survey came out in 2000, and apparently they had discussed the LSST. Discussed the Dark Matter Telescope, but didn't like the name. They hated the name. And so they decided to change the name, and they called it the Large Aperture Synoptic Survey Telescope. Say that fast. And it was in a mix of other recommended projects. They sort of liked it, they blessed it, but it was, it wasn't the top project, but it was in their top few projects. And I immediately had to go to the dictionary to look up the word synoptic. And it sort of means the big picture. So I'm sure there was a discussion on that committee about the acronym, because if you take the Large Aperture Synoptic Survey Telescope, literally it's LAST. And for a federal project, that's probably an unwise decision. So they called it LSST, and it's been known as that ever since. However, there have been a couple, actually more than 2 occasions since then for a name change, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. So if you know all about the technology, I'm going to tell you about what happens to you when you worry in the middle of the night about raising hundreds of millions of dollars quickly. So the years went by. We wrote proposals to the federal agencies, and sometimes they weren't even acknowledged correctly. One of them was returned without review. And it just was taking forever. They were nicely funding us for R&D, and we got R&D funding, R&D. But this elusive several $100 million that we needed to raise didn't seem to be, there was no light at the end of our tunnel at all. So, you know, you get desperate. And when you get desperate, you start thinking out of the box. Now, many of you don't realize that I'm related to Al Capone by marriage. Turns out. And I, since marrying Pat, I've got to know the Capone family really well, and just marvelous people. And you know, they'll do anything. You know, you have a problem, they'll take it. Really great people. This is for several generations later. But the idea just simply occurred, you know, well, you know, this is an interesting organization. It has advantages. So, you know, it's a worldwide organization. They take care of a lot of problems. No questions asked. And so I thought of the acronym, the OCT, the Organized Crime. And when you think about it, it makes sense. It's a worldwide organization. They're everywhere. They can take care of any problems you have. And instead of dealing with 2 federal agencies, you'd only worry about 1, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Well, this is, of course, a fanciful idea. I did socialize with a couple of my friends, and they realized that I was getting desperate. What actually happened next was a cell phone call. I think it was in 2008. I am not at liberty to tell you who it was from, but it was to call somebody in a theatrical agency in Hollywood about a highly placed advisor to a Middle East oil cartel. And the Sheikh Khalid bin Hamad Al Khalifa of Bahrain actually, so we were summoned by the Sheikh. He was, well, there was some negotiations. And then eventually we were summoned, and they were interested in LSST. They wanted to make a big splash. And so this was just about the same time that the next decadal survey, 2010, was beginning to ramp up. And my crew was busy responding to their really great questions. And so Steve and and Don Sweeney, who is, I think, here, were elected to be our representative. And so they bought plane tickets and were ready to go. And then there was another phone call from somebody else saying, well, you know, the Sheikh has to go to a special G5 meeting or something like that, and he's unavailable. I don't know if they heard of our backup plan. But our backup plan was to send Michael Strauss from Princeton. I'm not sure Michael knows this. They may have heard, they may have caught wind of that and got suspicious. At any rate, the whole thing fell through. They got interested in something else. A lot of money. I mean, these folks throw hundreds of millions of dollars. But luckily, this was just about the time that the decadal survey was coming out, and our project was blessed, and now we're back to dealing with 2 federal agencies instead of 1. And Steve is leading us forward as a marvelous director into construction. And so we've been funded by the NSF and the DOE to construct this marvelous facility. And it's been a delight, and continue to be, is a delight working with Steve and the rest of the crew, many of whom are actually here in the audience.
I'll have to talk to you about Al Capone, because I could use some help. But anyway, so we're now at the traditional stage in the program where we have what's called open mic. So I'd like to invite anyone who wants to say anything related to Steve to come forward. And we won't record it. I don't think we are. And so please come forward if you want to make a few remarks. Don't be bashful.
My name is Rich. I've known Steve for 50 years, a long time. And my sister-in-law warned me, have a beginning and an end. Don't ramble, because this is totally off the cuff. Okay, first about the sweaters. Well, Steve and I grew up on the North Shore of Long Island in Roslyn. And I think we knew each other in elementary school. We became friends in 7th grade. I've known Mrs. Kahn. You're still Mrs. Kahn to me since that time, Barbara. And when we got to college, because Steve and I were roommates when we were in college at Columbia, Steve, we know he's not that snazzy a dresser. And a story Steve likes to tell, because Steve has a very self-deprecating sense of humor, is that he would buy his clothing in the subway. This was in the early 1970s. There were stores in the subway. They didn't sell very nice merchandise. And Steve would buy very cheap, not so attractive clothing. Now, I should say that there, however, is one person worse dressed than Steve, that's me. Because I have actually taken sweaters from Steve's closet. So he was getting rid of them, and I've continued to wear them. So if this is supposed to be a roast, the roast is on me. I thought I'd tell you a little bit just about, because you all know him as this brilliant scientist. I dropped out of high school physics after the 2nd or 3rd day in 12th grade. I knew nothing about this stuff. I think Susan told Steve a long time ago to stop talking to Sarah and me about physics, because we were not getting it and it was going on for a long time. But I can tell you a little bit about Steve as a kid, and just as someone who's more than a physicist. Not to demean physics, but he's been into other things over the course of his life. Steve's a really good athlete. Martin was saying, I think it's Martin, right? Was saying that Steve was very skinny and he had good, watch out for his elbows on the basketball court. But we played basketball, softball, football every weekend for years with a group of good friends. We were known as the Cavaliers. And Steve's a really good athlete. Steve was an excellent tennis player through high school. He's a very good basketball player. He could stuff the hell out of you defending the basket. He's just a good athlete. He has a lot of talents. He's a really creative cartoonist. When he was a kid, he did a lot of cartooning, and he was really good at it. He would do it on the cover of his loose leaf in class. He would do it inside the loose leaf. He probably could have been an artist. And I would imagine this feeds into how he solves problems or his general creativity, but Steve has a lot of sides to him. One thing that we've always shared is that our interest in music. Like, this was my son playing the saxophone before. And Steve does, as Jesse said, have a very esoteric interest in music, and he likes a lot of really interesting, what to most people is weird music, but we know is intensely emotional and very beautiful music. And so Steve and I were both involved with a radio station in college, and Steve was into all this crazy music. And so the music you were hearing before was actually by great jazz musicians in New York in the 1970s who we would go to hear, people like Billy Harper, Sam Rivers, and there was this song Beatrice that Jesse played, which was written for Sam Rivers' wife, and Steve would go to this place, Studio Ridley, which was a loft just off the Bowery, and Sam Rivers' wife would be at the door taking you $3, and that was Beatrice that this beautiful ballad was written about. And this was in an apartment, a little apartment building, 3 stories, that Robert De Niro's mother owned. And above us, we've since discovered Robert Mapplethorpe, the very kind of controversial, famous sculptor, was working on the 2nd floor while we were downstairs seeing all this wild music. What else? Gosh, I've just known the family a long time. Susan and Sarah and Steve and I would go on vacation. I've known Isaac since he was a baby, when he was sucking down prodigious amounts of apple cider out of a baby bottle. I'm not sure. One thing I did want to say is that, for those of us who've known Steve for a long time, I mean, Steve can be really grumpy, right? You don't think of him as someone with incredible people skills. It doesn't surprise me. He was always so smart that he became a physicist. I mean, when we were in 7th, 8th grade in advanced math in junior high school, I was the worst in the class. Steve was the guy in the back row. The arm goes up. He's got the proof, the theorem, the minute the teacher asks for it. And he's, telling the teacher what to write on the board and how to prove the axiom or whatever it was. Steve was also a tremendous reader. He was always really brilliant in our English classes. He was one of the leaders of class discussions. He knows literature inside and out. He still reads contemporary literature. Okay, so now I'm rambling, right? The one thing I wanted to say was that some of us maybe wonder, well, sometimes I think, how did Steve become so successful? Not as a scientist. It doesn't surprise me that he's successful as a scientist. I don't know, are you a theorist? I don't even know if you're a theorist. You're not a theorist. You've done research. This kind of stuff doesn't surprise me, but how did you become successful as an administrator, someone who puts together gigantic projects and manages staffs and stuff? And I'm not really just, sometimes I pose that thought to myself, but I know the answer really is that Steve is a thoroughly good person who is just not any kind of a bullshitter. He's a total honest guy. He's organized, obviously, but I think it's more than that. I would imagine that as a manager, he's always doing what's honest and justifiable, even if it's difficult. And that probably has something to do with the fact that he's successful at that, and also the fact that he's just really smart, really capable of so many things, and such a creative person, I think, and a wonderful person. So Steve's like my best friend, and I'm kind of amazed. All these people are just really wow.
As Chuck Klaver. I'm the assistant scientist for LSST, and I've been working with Steve for the better part of 12 years now on this project. So I thought I'd offer another viewpoint of Steve, the esteemed physicists that have spoken so eloquently thus far tonight. So I'm an astronomer by training, and I first met Steve, I think it was in 2001, 2002. We were sitting in the director's office at the National Optical Astronomy Observatories, and we were talking about this idea of this wonderful telescope that's now known as LSST. At that time, I've been working off and on with Tony for the past 3 or 4 years on this project. And my graduate training is in white dwarf stars, so I knew Steve by name as an X-ray astronomer who did a couple things with X-rays on white dwarfs. I'm looking at him and saying, we got this grand optical telescope with this huge optical mosaic camera that we're going to build. And we're going, X-ray astronomer? Really? But Steve's enthusiasm for this project was evident at the time. But yet, I was cautious. And, you know, we had some interactions throughout the years as we got to know each other. And I always got the impression that Steve took this telescope kind of for granted. And it was, you know, this telescope. How hard can it be? And being a telescope guy for my whole career, I was maybe a little bit offended. So at some point we endeavored to go down to Chile. There was a small group of us who went to the Paranal Observatory of ISA. And there's these 4 8-meter class telescopes sitting on one mountaintop. It's really impressive to see when you go stand there in person. And we got the grand tour. We got to see the telescopes, the intricacies of all the mechanics and the things that make a real observatory work. And on our way back, we were traveling. There's a long road trip from the observatory to the nearest town, Augusta. And we're on the way back. I was sitting next to Steve in the travel elevator, and Steve leaned over to me and kind of quietly, so that nobody else could hear it, said, "No, Chuck, this is more complicated than I thought." And at that point, I knew that this guy was going to be okay. I could work with this guy. And I hope that trip opened Steve's eyes just a little bit to the world of telescopes and astronomy. But that, I want to share to you that absolutely dwarfs in comparison to what Steve has done for me. You know, being an astronomer by training, my interactions with Steve over the years has opened my career, my horizon, my viewpoint to a world I never even thought possible. The fact that I'm standing here at Stanford interacting with some of the greatest physicists around and the greatest engineers working on this camera is attributed to Steve's involvement. So that's all I want to say. And Steve, thank you.
I'm Stu Boyer, and I was Steve's PhD supervisor. And I want to give a little self-aggrandizement talk here. I had some really great X-ray data, and I had a postdoc who had been from England, who had been working in X-ray data and producing papers. And Steve came out, and I knew he was clever. And so I said, hey, you go work with this guy, and you guys write papers. And I didn't have to do a thing. That's what they did. Okay, and they just churned them out like mad. Because we had 2 things. We had some unique data, and we had some 2 clever guys. Okay, and but then I wanted to make sure that this guy, you know, had a future. And so one night, while Lick Observatory, which at that time was a really, you know, forefront telescope, somebody crept out and they had it overnight, and they called up and said, "Do you have something that you can do, Stuart?" I said, "Oh yeah." So I got Steve, I called Steve in, and I said, "Steve, go down there tonight to Lick Observatory and observe something." He goes, "Well, what do I observe?" I said, "I don't care, observe anything." And I figured, see, that he would go down there, and then if it ever came up in some job interview that, you know, said, "Well, have you ever done any optical astronomy?" He could have said, truthfully, "Yeah, I observed at Lick Observatory." But anyway, little did I know, and here's the self-aggrandizement, that I taught him all the optical astronomy he knows.
Anyone else? Otherwise, given the hour, we'll move on here. I think we still have one more event, and that's to hear from Steve. But before we do that, I'd like to just say something about, I opened with this. This is a milestone in Steve's career. He's turned a little over 60 years old at this point. So welcome to the aging group of scientists in this room. Now, I think, I don't know if Lenny's here. Lenny, are you here? Lenny Suskin. Anyway, Lenny taught me something years ago. He's a very distinguished theoretical physicist here at Stanford. And Lenny, about 10 years ago, said to me, as he was coming into the physics building, he said, you know, getting old isn't for wimps. And Lenny's not a wimp, if you know him. Well, you know what? Steve's not a wimp either. And we know that because, in fact, you know, wimps are actually hard to detect. And Steve is definitely detectable. Anyway, Steve.
So I kind of used up my speech earlier today. But anyway, I really have to thank everybody for coming in. And just looking out at this room is an amazing experience. You know, it's I don't know, we got probably 10 observatory directors sitting in the room, a bunch of Nobel Prizes. I never dreamed I was going to be in this situation. And Rich and I were in junior high school playing basketball. The major thing was just try to score a basket. There's a lot of people sitting here that, you know, I've learned from every single person I work with. Every student, every engineer. You know, physicists like to talk about how brilliant they are. Physicists don't really do anything. Engineers do things. My mother's an engineer. My father actually was an engineer also, but he was not a great engineer. He was too much of a physicist to be an engineer. You know, my father would work for various aerospace companies, and they would say, you know, build this thing. And you know what a proper engineer does is, you know, okay, so who's built things like this before? And you go research that, and you figure out who's done it before, and you change 1 or 2 parameters, and it's done. My father would go back to F equals MA. And that's what he did for my sister and I. When I met Susan, I brought Susan back to New York, and I said, you're going to meet my family. And she said, oh, okay, great, yeah, no, fine. And I said, they're a little weird. They do math problems at the dinner table. We went to a place called Roslyn Cafe, which Rich knows well. And Roslyn Cafe has placemats with all kinds of like mathematical puzzles on them. And we sit down, and everybody in the family starts screwing around. And Susan is looking around saying, like, what planet? Who does this stuff? But it was great training. My mother is a crossword puzzle expert. That's what got me interested in it. I started doing crossword puzzles in college based on my mother. And actually, frankly, it's the thing I'm most personally proud of. I'm really good at crossword puzzles. They don't matter at all, but you know, like I really like crossword puzzles. Anyway, I can't describe how you know much this gets to me. All you guys coming tonight, it's been a tremendous experience. I hope you've had some exposure to some of the personal things about my family and me that you may not have known so much about. My family is sitting at this table. Our closest friends are sitting at this table. And then, of course, there's all my scientific friends that go back many, many years. Fritz, Chuck, Fiona, And then my new LSST friends like Tony, Ian Shipsey came in from England just to make this meeting. I now know a bunch of people in Tucson. It's not even on a coast. That's Roger said, Dave Silva, the director, and anyway, okay. Anyway, thank you all. This has been a tremendous experience, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Before you get up to leave, you'll notice at the center of the tables there are wonderful flower bouquets, and we'd like you to. These are going to be gifts to some of you, and you'll find out who you are by reaching under your chair, and there will be under some chairs, one at each table presumably, there will be a note that says, "You are the lucky winner of the bouquet on this table." So have a look. Anyway, thank you all.